Welcome back to Forensic Assessment in Civil Cases, Part 2. Okay, so we were talking about the assessment of competence. What do psychologists need to do to assess competence? First thing, they got to determine 4 criteria, right? And so, you can see the underlined key words in each 4 of these sentences. First, can the individual understand basic info relevant to the decision? If they can't understand the info, then it's hard for them to competently make a decision because they can't process the info in the first place. Again, when we're talking the elderly who, have dementia, Alzheimer's, what have you, then this can be very difficult. They don't understand the basic information relevant to their decision. Okay. Can the individual apply info to the situation and predict consequences of various choices? So it's one thing to understand the information, but can you use it? And that's basically what this is about. Can you apply the information? Can the individual use logical thinking to evaluate the pros and cons? And you know that we've been talking pros and cons, we've been talking needs assessment throughout this course. Here it comes up again. What are the pros and cons? So when you're discussing with your loved ones, your elderly loved ones, and they say, well, I want to stay in my house forever. And it's like, well, I can understand why you would want to do that. There's some pros, but what are the cons in making that decision as well? And then, can individual communicate decision or choice to others? And that might be problematic. We see different kinds of aphasia. Broca's aphasia, right, is not being able to generate words. Wernicke is maybe not to be able to understand. Maybe I got those backwards. But to the extent that those are components of the dementia, those can be tested, and that then determines a person's level of competence within that domain. So, when is assessment of competence most frequent? Well, it's when individuals, refuse medical or psychological treatment. And do they have the capacity to make that decision is usually the question. Are they competent to make that decision? Fortunately, this one is one of the more easy ones to get around. The research shows that this process of unpacking a treatment choice might increase compliance. Often we'll explain, hey, you need this treatment, and here's why you need this treatment, but we don't really kind of develop an incremental explanation that someone who is suffering some mental impairment can understand. So unpacking it is breaking it down into smaller chunks and allowing someone to process those chunks and eventually being able to reassemble those chunks to have a greater understanding of the choice they're making. Right? If a loved one has cancer and they say, I don't want any chemo, and you say, well, actually you have a very good prognosis. A single round of chemo has been shown 90% of the time to generate complete remission in your type of cancer, right? You really should go for this. I don't want no chemo or nothing, But then if you spell it out, if you break it down and you address each of their concerns one at a time, and maybe you have to do it a couple times for each one, but to move them through the process in an incremental fashion. And this would represent a non-legal resolution to the conflict. But if it doesn't work, and then you say, well, I don't think this person is making the right choice, you go to the courts, you bring up the issue of competence, right? And then the judge will assign a clinician to administer tests to determine if the person was in fact competent to make that decision. Okay. Now let's moving towards civil commitment. This authorizes the custody and restraint of persons who, as a result of mental illness, are a danger to themselves and others. And I think of the tragic story of my buddy Tim. Both his parents kind of simultaneously descended into dementia. They were in their 80s, and it was just a horrible situation. 3 brothers are trying to take care of the parents in a rotating fashion. The parents are insistent upon remaining in their own home. And Tim tells me the story. He gets there one Friday night, shows up, and he walks in. There's his dad, who's been a postal worker all his life. Old guy, old school, right? Mom has always done all the housework, all the cooking, all the cleaning, all the laundry. She's not capable of doing that anymore because she's descended more deeply into dementia than the dad has. And so now dad is doing all these things he doesn't know how to do and is kind of incapable of learning how to do them because of the dementia, and Tim walks into the house and he smells something right away, and it smells like something's burning, and he goes into the kitchen and there's a pot of something on the stove that is kind of like all burned away and is continuing, to smoke. And it's like, how long can this go on before these people hurt or kill themselves, right? And if we're talking, we can blow that up. If people live in a condominium or an apartment complex, to what extent are they a danger to everyone living in that facility rather than in a single unit house, right? So the civil commitment is something that's brought up. I don't think these people are capable of taking care of themselves any longer, right? Now, O'Connor versus Donaldson, 1975, is a huge protection in this regard because it says you can't be confined to a mental institution simply for being mentally ill, right? You have to be dangerous as well. And dangerousness can be reinterpreted as a grave disability that can fundamentally lead to, or predictably lead to, a danger to themselves or others. So how does it work? Well, there's 4 types of commitment procedures. Emergency without a court order. You go, you know, and this is if the police suspect that you're mentally ill, right? You encounter the police, you're running around the freeway or something, the police say, oh my God, why is this person running around the freeway? You try to explain to them and they're not buying your explanation, you know, then they may take you straight to the mental hospital and they're going to keep you there for 72 hours. Under observation, a clinician will evaluate you. So that's how most cases start, right, is this very short-term 2 to 3 day. And when the police do it, the procedures are very similar to an arrest. If we remember back, God, it's going to be a long time ago now, what, 10, 12 years ago, this is what happened to Britney Spears. The sheriff showed up at Britney Spears and said, hey, you got to be checked out, come with us. And they kept her for 2 days to assess her, and then she was released. Now, voluntary commitment, right, is, boy, I'm losing it, I don't know what's going on anymore, I think I need to go to the hospital and be checked out, right? So we can volunteer to be committed if we find that we are suffering a grave mental disorder which causes dangers, then it might lead to step 3, or step 1 can lead to step 3 as well. That is a court-ordered involuntary commitment. There's a court hearing to determine if the individual is dangerous or too disabled to care for themselves, and then the court is going to decide what should happen as a result of that. And this is usually in the result of grave disability. Expect to see more and more of this. We have an aging population, and we seem to have an increasing incidence of Alzheimer's and other dementias. So these certainly fill that pattern, right? And then outpatient commitment. That is, once I have recovered sufficiently from, let's say, a voluntary or an involuntary commitment, I might be placed on outpatient commitment. And this is ordered after a hospital stay. Now remember, when we talked about Hinckley, John Hinckley Jr., the attempted assassination of President Reagan, Hinckley, right, is outpatient commitment at this point. And he will be, I would assume, for the rest of his life, he will be required to talk to psychologists. Now, who's dangerous and who's not? Well, dangerousness and risk assessment. Dangerousness is defined as acts of physical violence or aggression by one person against another. So notice this is not the disability type dangerousness, but psychological studies abound on this. And risk assessments is when clinicians try to predict who's likely to behave violently under certain circumstances using available data and research. So psychologists may be called upon to interview someone to determine what their level of dangerousness is. You can see how this might be useful in a bail determination as well. Problem is, dangerousness among mentally ill is rare, and it's hard to find good data to help with the prediction. And this really is kind of an individual case-by-case basis. Predictions not all accurate. When are predictions most accurate? Well, if we're predicting over the short term, like what's going to happen tomorrow, what's going to happen Saturday, what's going to happen the next week. Long-term predictions less accurate, right? So predicting in the short term. Now, when predicting dangerousness in settings where a clinician knows about the individual's past behavior. And remember, psychology principle number 1, at least in my book, is what's the best predictor of future behavior? You got it, past behavior. All else being equal, it's not a guarantee, but it's the best predictor. When the prediction considers a person's history of past violent behavior, and this is the best predictor. Someone's been violent in the past. What is our rationale for thinking they won't be violent in the future, especially in a similar situation? And when prediction is made for people with, from groups with statistically high rates of violence, and this becomes more of an actuarial judgment rather than an individual judgment. Again, But the downside to this is we're looking at groups, we're looking at an individual and saying, oh, you're this group member, and we stereotype this group as. Now, the stereotype, of course, could be supplanted by statistical data, right? And then becomes less stereotypical. So, under these circumstances, who's going to become violent? Who will be violent? And this will not be mind-blowing, I guarantee you. Guess what? People with a history of violence, right? Younger patients tend to be more violent, right? I remember I worked with a guy, he worked at Boise Cascade at the Vancouver Mill. He was their total quality manager. And I was doing the total quality transformation trainings at the Vancouver Mill with him. And he was a great guy. And I remember one time he said this, and he said it a couple times thereafter. He said, most dangerous thing on the planet is a 15-year-old male with a gun. And it's like, well, yeah, adolescent males, you know, don't have the highly developed prefrontal cortex yet, but they have a tremendous hormonal push. That can equate danger. Younger patients, probably more. People with a history of relationship instability may be more violent. Pattern of alcohol or drug abuse, and I would say yes, except there's a lot of contaminating or confounding factors here. And also I think the drug use, the drug being used, makes a difference. People using alcohol shuts down the inhibitory process, probably more likely to be violent. People use meth, probably more likely to be violent. People who ingest cannabis, probably not a good indicator of future violence, right? It's not. So I think the approach should not be as global as this, but more specified as to the individual nature of the drug and the person. People with major mental disorders, and this one is highly controversial. Some people are on board with this. Other people say, look, people with mental disorders are no more violent than anyone else. So a lot of debate around that. Now, people who demonstrate early problems with adjustment at home or school, but again, we got to be careful because we don't want to fall into a self-fulfilling prophecy. We don't want to facilitate violence by prophesizing that people would. History of escapes from custody, sure, why not? If someone's willing to attempt to escape from custody, they're probably not a big rule follower, and avoiding violence is probably not at the top of their list either. Right? Now, I promised to return to Becker and his gift of fear. Remember that the Becker agency, this is one of the big things they do, is assess risk, right? So if you're going to fire an employee, and you know, you might call up to Becker and say, hey, look, we got to fire this employee, but I'm concerned that he might retaliate or somehow do something as a result of the firing. You call up to Becker, they can come out and they can do the risk assessment. They use what's called the JACA prediction model. So it's an acronym, let's do it. First of all, to what extent does the person demonstrate perceived justification or believe they're justified in retaliating as a result? Right? To what extent are there perceived alternatives, but this is kind of the flip side, that the person perceives no alternatives, that you fired me, you've destroyed my life, there's really nothing else good that's going to happen for me. So when they have few alternatives, then violence becomes, in fact, maybe the go-to. Those people who perceive the consequences as inconsequential or not mattering. And those certainly who have the ability, right? So, what are we looking at then? The formula is high justification, no or few alternatives, lack of consequences, high perceived ability, all predict greater likelihood of violence. And notice how de Becker puts an honest-to-God formula to this. And that's it for us today. So I want to thank you guys. And again, I hope all is going well in our very strange times and circumstances here. We'll be back for 12 and 13, which are going to be about jury decision making in two parts. So those will be appearing online next week. Bye-bye.